Hello, Internet. I am working on this Mazda CX9 here today. Going to put a front wheel bearing in it because you're not supposed to be able to do that. You're not supposed to be able to do that. That's bad. So what I wanted to do was take the time and talk about what all's involved here and what your options are if you have a bad wheel bearing in the front. Because I did a video like this for the rear, and I have not done one for the front. And when I was doing the front for the very first time, there was a severe lack of what I consider decent videos on this. So I am here to help you. Now, if you're just stopping by to see what all is involved, after you get your wheel and your brake caliper and all that off, and pull your spindle nut, we'll talk about that in a second, but pull that spindle nut off before you take your wheel off, my opinion, unless you got a really good impact gun. You basically have two options for replacing the bearing in this. You can either replace the bearing itself, or you can replace this entire steering knuckle assembly. And you may notice, or you may not, but this knuckle has already been replaced. When the wheel bearing went out on this for the first time, when the factory one finally gave up, we put a bearing in it. It didn't last horribly long, and then it needed another bearing. And when that second bearing was pressed in here, I didn't quite like the way it was sitting in the knuckle. And I said to Dad, we probably ought to order a steering knuckle to have on hand in case this bearing doesn't last. And sure enough, it didn't. It did not last very long, and so ended up putting a whole knuckle in. Now, as I mentioned in that little story there, yes, you do have to press this bearing out. It doesn't take a lot of force, but it takes enough that you're going to have a press. Even a cheap Harbor Freight one will do the job. But if you don't have access to a press, you might be interested in just replacing this whole knuckle. Regardless of what you do, this entire piece has to come out of here. So it's up to you on what you want to do. Is it really any easier to replace the knuckle compared to the bearing? I suppose technically, but the press is doing all the work to press the bearing out, so it's not really any more effort because, like I said, that has to come out of here regardless. Cost is really cost, time, whether or not you have access to a press, either one yourself or a shop where they would be willing to do that for you real quick for, a small fee. Those are really the big factors here. This particular knuckle, if I remember right, was about $120 from the Rock Auto, which is where I get all my parts. And the bearing, the nice NTN bearing, made in Japan bearing, they were $40 a piece, and I got two of them. And so, it's up to you whether or not you want to do that. I imagine your brick and mortar stores will sell this whole knuckle, but it's going to be pricey. It's going to be a lot more than $120 if I had to guess. O'Reilly will sell the bearing. I imagine other places do too. But in my opinion, O'Reilly wheel bearings, at least for these Mazdas, are kind of hit and miss. For the Ford Super Duty pickups, they're not too bad, but for these Mazdas, they're kind of hit and miss. And who wants to pay like $80 for a bearing when you could buy one for $40 and you could buy the spindle nut and pay the shipping and the tax and still be out less money? But, then you got to wait for Rock Auto to ship it to you, and if you need it like now, you got to pay for convenience, So that's kind of what you're looking at. Now, to get this actual knuckle off, once you pull your caliper and all that, and if you're doing the wheel bearing on this, I assume you know how to at least get to this point. You kind of have to be at least that mechanically inclined. But there's two bolts here you'd need to take out. And yeah, they are just bolts and nuts. Sometimes I forget if one of these is like welded in. They're not. These are just bolts and nuts. You have to pull this out back. You have to pull your tie rod, steering link, whatever. I forget the name. You have to take this apart. I definitely use an impact on that. If you try and use a wrench, you run the risk of spinning this kind of press fit joint. It's just a light press fit joint in there. You run the risk of spinning it, and that's bad. And then you have to pull this control arm off, or sway bar or whatever. Again, I forget my front end terminology now. And then what's fun about this one in particular is that there's actually on the back side here, there's an indent for like an Allen wrench. So you have to hold this stud with your Allen wrench and then get a regular wrench and turn this nut, which, oh yeah, it's super fun. You don't have to do it on the top necessarily, but on the bottom there, yeah, you have to do that, and it sucks. And then you also need to take loose this clamping bolt, or this pinch bolt right back in here. And there's a little metal like retaining tab. You'll just have to pop that out of the way. And you'll want to take that pinch bolt out too. And then you'll have to get in there with like a screwdriver or something and kind of open it up just a little bit. You don't have to go crazy with it, so that you can pop the control arm out of the bottom of the steering knuckle. This strut is going to want to come down. And so if you could somehow rig a way to pry down on that control arm to get it out from under here, and then you can kind of wiggle it out up top. And then the whole time you have to get this CV axle out of here without damaging it too much. They have a lot of degree of rotation, so you're pretty flexible there. Just don't like hammer on the boot or anything and tear it, because that's bad. And then you just kind of have to work it out of here, and it sucks. It's not super fun. I'm not going to try and show you because there's just no room. And I don't see any need to. It's pretty self-explanatory once you start doing it. And then, you know, you also have to take like your wheel speed sensor off here. It's just a 10 mil bolt back in there. 10 millimeter headed bolt. Get in the right spot right there. You have to pull that out and all that stuff. And it sometimes sticks, and so you have to maneuver it. Sometimes you have to get nasty and get on it with channel locks and wiggle it back and forth and then pop it out. It's kind of a process. But then once you get it out, there is a snap ring on the back side here, I believe, that you have to pull out, and then you can put this on the press and you push your bearing out. This part should come with it. If you are super professional, you can take all this stuff off with an impact gun, even with chrome sockets. I mean, I've had all this apart before, so I knew how it would come apart because I didn't like crank down on it as hard as I possibly could. So the only thing here that stuck for me, I zipped everything off with the impact. Not a big deal, even that bottom pinch bolt. The one that sucks the most is always this stupid sway bar link. That is always the one that's going to want to fight you. And so now I'm trying to remember if it was easier to do the bottom or the top. And if I remember right, I may have cross-threaded one or the other. So I don't remember if I was taking it apart up here or down below. I might be taking it apart down below. That might be why it's all torn up down there. I don't know. But that's the only one that's going to fight me so far. And then I'll get it maneuvered out of here. We'll take a closer look at it, and I'll show you kind of what all it looks like back in there and what it looks like pressed out and things like that. All right, got her out. We'll go look at the unit here in a minute. But I wanted to add a couple of important things. First important thing, like I said, this is going to want to drift down once it gets loose. So getting it back in, we'll talk about getting it back in later. The bigger thing I want to talk about is this stud, okay, for this link. If you are a sensible person, like I am, or pretend to be, when you go to take this off, what you're going to quickly realize is that it is absolutely asinine for you to hold that nut, or to try and turn the nut while holding the stud. It's a lot easier if you can just turn the stud and hold the nut. And if you do that, and I wouldn't recommend putting a lot of force on it just because, where is it? You need, hang on, let me turn it here. You're going to need that size of hex to fit in here properly and turn it. And I would not recommend putting like an enormous amount of force on there. But if it's loose enough that you can turn it with a ratchet, remember that since you are turning the stud, okay, and you're holding the nut, you need to have your ratchet on tighten, okay? Because if you were taking the nut off, it would be lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. But since you're turning the stud, it's backwards, if that makes any sense. So don't have your ratchet set on loosen and then come on here and crank down on this, because all you're doing is tightening it while the nut's being held. Okay? And that is a 17 mil wrench is what you will need to hold that, by the way. So just make sure your ratchet's on tighten if you decide to turn the stud. It might be stuck enough that you can't, and that you're better off to turn the nut and hold the stud. In which case, the same theory kind of applies. But I wanted to mention that real quick. This grease is all me, because the first time I took this apart, it was rusted in there, and it was a nightmare to get this apart. Part of the issue was that I didn't 100% know what I was doing because, like I said earlier, wasn't a lot of great videos around, but I greased this just so it came out easier, and it comes out nice every time, which is awesome. So, with the wind coming up, we'll go over here. So here's the steering knuckle, cute little steering knuckle, nothing much to it. I mentioned that there's a snap ring in here, and I'm going to be honest with you, I started thinking about it, and I don't remember if there's one in here or not. But I think if there is, and I might be wrong on how this comes apart, you may have to press the hub part out first, then the bearing. Like press the hub out, pull the snap ring, press the bearing out, press a new bearing in, put the snap ring back in, and then push the hub in. I don't 100% remember. But the snap ring in question, which I went ahead and ordered some new ones just because I didn't know, it looks like this. It should fit in there. And then, of course, we have good bearing to go back in. I don't know what bearing Ultra Power used because this is an Ultra Power knuckle, but it sucks because it didn't even last 20,000 miles, like barely 20,000. And then, oddly enough, the Ultra Power, Dorman, and SKP part number for this piece right here is all the same. I don't know if there's a quality difference or not, but all the part numbers are the same. So, there's that. But when I'm going to go press this out and put everything back together, I'll let you know for sure how it goes in and all that. All right, good news, everyone. I messed up. And you might be wondering, why is it good news that you messed up, Owen? Well, because I made a critical mistake that if I had not noticed it, then I would have put this video together and uploaded it, and I would have given you guys some bad information. So yesterday I get the first bearing, and that'll become important in a second, but I get the first bearing pressed in, everything's nice and tight, all good. I come home, put it all together, take it for a test drive, and it's still howling. So I get back to the house, jack up the passenger side, grab the wheel, and it's still loose, like I didn't change the bearing. And so needless to say, I wasn't very happy. And I thought for a minute that, I got just a bad bearing or whatever, and I wasn't very happy about it. But I got to thinking, and I think the reason that one failed is because of the way I pressed it in. So what I'm going to do right now is describe to you what I believe to be the correct procedure for pressing this bearing in and out and putting the hub in it without damaging it and making sure that everything stays tight when you get it back on the vehicle, and we are still tight right now. So, to get this apart, you're going to have to drive the hub out first, okay? And so to do that, it's kind of heavy one-handed. You're going to want to come on the back side. Right in here, this part, this is the hub. Get on that, driver straight out, okay? Once you've got that part out, and you're going to have one of the inner races on the bearing come with it, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. But once you've got this out, there's going to be a snap ring on this side. It's a big snap ring. You're going to want a good pair of internal snap ring pliers. Get that out of there. The way I did it, just because it was hard to squeeze that in and then come up with it, it wanted to keep slipping off the pliers. So I squeezed it in, and I got in with a flathead screwdriver and kind of popped one end up, and then I covered it with my hand and a little rag because it'll want to spring, and I just worked around with the screwdriver, popping it the rest of the way out. It's not hard. So once you get that snap ring out, then you can flip it back over and drive the bearing out this way, okay? So you'll put it back on your press, and you'll get on this side, and you'll press the bearing right out. You can get on this inner race to drive it out. It should come out with no problem. So to get, because like I said, you're going to have one of these inner races, because if you've looked at these bearings, and this is the one that was in there, it's got two inner races, okay? And what will happen is, and you can see this one moves just because I've had it apart. This was the side that was on the hub. This inner race right here, this part came out. So to get it off is, it's not bad. If you have a bearing breaker / bearing puller, it's a lot easier. You might go rent one from a brick and mortar store if you don't have one, and I think they have a tool rental program, most of them, and I think they have bearing breakers. And you can go do that if you want, but I live, at least 45 minutes away from the nearest brick and mortar store that's open on a Sunday especially. So what I did, because yesterday, the shop that I go to do this, just as a quick aside, the shop that I go to is a business that works on stuff. And so sometimes the main mechanic is there on a Saturday doing stuff, and he was yesterday. So he used his bearing puller, and he got this inner race off the hub for me. But this morning, he was not there, which is okay. So I essentially took a couple of chisels, and I got in between the backside of the hub face, and where the inner race is at. And you'll see what I mean if this happens to you. And I kind of just drove them in like wedges to pop that race up, and then I just kind of worked it a little bit, enough so that I could put a bolt and some washers right inside of here and a puller and pull that off. And it's kind of awkward. You just want something that's going to fit inside the hub face in this part, okay? Because if it sits on the outside, you're not going to be able to pull this inner race off, right? So that's kind of how I got that off. The Mazda manual says to grind this down until you can remove it with a chisel. But there's no good way for me to get on it with a grinder, bench grinder, die grinder, or whatever. There's no good way to get on it, which is why I did it with chisels. So when you get all that off, clean your hub up and everything. The important part is when you go to press your new bearing in, okay? When you're pressing your new bearing in, and you won't do it on this side because your hub is still going to be out. You want to make sure all this is clean. You're going to press your bearing in on this side in here, right? Okay, so when you press your bearing in, it's very important that you do not press it in on the inner race. Very, very important. And I think this is where I screwed up yesterday, because I pressed it in on the inner race, and then if that didn't hurt it, which if you're pressing here, it shouldn't, but I think the bigger thing that hurt it was when I went to go press the hub back in, I was not supporting the bottom inner race, and so when that hub came in, like so, it grabbed this other race kind of cockeyed and started moving it, right? And I think that's what screwed it up. So to fix that, when you go to press this back in, get your new bearing in your hub and get it kind of square, and then get something that's going to run across the entire face of it. Not quite like that. You're going to want something a little bigger. You want to cover the entire, because you want to push on the outer race of the bearing. You want to push it in until it's flush, okay, down in here, which this is, you want it flush with this, okay? Then once it's flush, you're going to take your old bearing and line the outer races up and then press it in the rest of the way. That way you are pressing on the outer race and not on the inner races. You do not want to do that, because that is bad. So then after you get that done and you get your new bearing in, you can put your snap ring back in, and then come on the underside of your knuckle assembly, right? And you're going to want to get on this race with something solid. I had this chunk of lathed steel, okay? But you want to support that inner race and then press your hub in. Obviously, you won't go this way. Press your hub on. But you want this on the bottom side supporting the inner race on that bearing. That's very, very important. And it looks a lot better than it did. There's no play in it, and hopefully it's going to stay that way when I put it on the vehicle. We will find out. But I am almost certain that yesterday when I just pushed this in and I didn't support, this part of the bearing, I'm almost certain that's what screwed it up. So hopefully it will be fine this time. If you're seeing this video, it's probably okay. And I verified all that because, don't do that. Press on the outer race on your bearings. Don't press on the inner race. And just as an aside, none of this presses in hard. It really doesn't. Do not try and drive it in with a hammer, okay? You do have to press it in, but it doesn't take a great deal of pressing force to do it. I wouldn't try using a hand puller. I mean, it might work, but I'd just as soon do it with a real press. Even a cheap-ass Harbor Freight one would do the job. So I have now gained a new special tool. This is my Mazda front wheel bearing press adapter, which is important. And then this also serves a similar function. So that'll go in the parts pile. And we will go put this back on. I got some installation pointers for you. And then I'll test drive it, and hopefully this time it actually works. All right, installation. This is the best way that I have found to do it. There might be a faster, easier way. I don't know what it would be. This works the best because then, well, it just does, okay? So the first thing that you should do here is, if this doesn't have grease on it, I recommend putting grease on, because the first time I ever took this apart, this was dry and it was rusted in there, and it was a pain in the ass to get out. So the first thing you want to do is put your knuckle on the lower ball joint here, okay? And as you notice, there's a groove cut in that ball joint. And the reason why, if I can find it here, where did I put that? Well, the reason why is so that if you get everything in right, that gives this bolt just enough clearance to slide through that right there. So you want to start with this, then once you get it on, go ahead and put your bolt through, and then shove your CV axle in, okay? And then you're going to want to make sure that your sway bar link is in, because if you try and shove it up into your shock or your strut, what's going to happen is you won't be able to move this control arm down or up enough with this attached to then get this sway bar link back in. So, ball joint first, shove your CV axle in, make sure your sway bar link is in. You don't have to put the nut on. Then you can shove it up in the tower. To get it in the tower, once you've got everything on, and I do actually recommend putting the nut on that sway bar link just to make sure it doesn't drop out while you're getting everything in. You can also go ahead and put this nut on if you want. I wouldn't tighten it all the way until you've got it in the tower, you know. I got her firmed up now. And we're still nice and tight on the hub, which is good. Yeah, we're fine. All right, so to get this in here, best way that I've found, quite honestly, is to use a screwdriver and get right up on that spot right there. See if you can get you in a little better light. And it's not much. You're gonna have to keep some pressure on this, but it gives you enough of a lip that you can pry down on this with one hand and then kind of shove it in with the other hand. And then once you've got it in approximately where you want, you can shove your bolts through. I recommend doing the top first, and then the bottom one is not so bad. And then once you get them in, of course, you can put your nuts on. And then after this, that's really about it. You know, you put your tie rod in and get that on, and then you can put your brake rotor and your caliper and all that stuff back on. Do not forget your wheel speed sensor. I've done that more than once. And do not forget your brake hose clip that goes here. All right? And then once you get everything on, you should have enough room to come through the center of the wheel with your 1 7/16 socket. Okay? I'm going to snug this up as much as I can right now, and then I'll finish it once the wheel's on, and I will stake the nut again. I already did it once, but I'm going to stake it again just to be on the safe side. It shouldn't come loose, but why take chances? So that's how you reassemble. Alright, so after a 20-mile test drive, it seems to be okay. When you're double checking to make sure your wheel bearing is good, make sure you're not coming on the outside here, because you see how it moves? That's because that tie rod end back in there is a little loose. What you want to do is come up top and on the bottom and feel for play, and there is none. It is still nice and tight. You also want to look in here and make sure that your wheel, your rim is not moving on the rotor. Make sure your lug nuts are tight. I've had that problem before on this, but if you come to the front and back of the tire and they're moving it, chances are, especially if you've got play in your tie rod end, you're going to have play. But I'm telling you right now, that's not... The whole steering knuckle and stuff is moving, so I'm confident that that's okay. It's kind of windy today, so it's hard to tell, but I'm going to call that fixed. Because if it's not, then we'll have to put a steering knuckle in, and I'll tack something onto the end of this video if that's what we end up having to do. So that should do it. I hope this helps you out. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you later. Take care.